Good morning, good afternoon to those of you joining us from outside of Europe, and welcome to the CDSB webinar, a briefing on the TCFD disclosures under the EU Non-Financial Disclosure Directive. We are very excited to have you join us today. We are also quite lucky to be joined by two excellent speakers. We have Fiona Quinlan from the CDSB team, who has been leading our review of the status of European reporting, as well as Eric Dujolet, a partner from Deloitte France, who is also a member of the TCFD and has had very many various roles throughout his career, including global lead for sustainability services at Deloitte, and I'm sure most of you know him already from many various roles. We're very happy to have you with us today, especially as we are currently witnessing a review of the EU Non-Financial Reporting Directive, and so it's a good time to look back at what the market is doing, to learn what has happened, and to improve reporting in Europe based on real life practice. And of course, just last week, the TCFD has published its most recent status report, and so we're very it's a very opportune time for Eric to join us. And there are, of course, consultations out and to some recently launched guidances by the task force that Eric will tell us about as well. So I can see some of you have already managed to get used to the platform. Wherever you are joining us from, please use the chat function. We do receive your comments, and we will be able to address your comments. If you have any other troubles, there's also an email address at the bottom of the screen, info@cdsb.net, and you can email us there as well. And without further ado, I hope you can get comfortable and enjoy the presentation. Without further ado, I'll hand over to Fiona to give us a bit of an overview of what the market is doing these days in terms of TCFD implementation in Europe. Over to you, Fiona.
Sure, thank you, Mike, and hello and good day to everyone. It's great to join you. So I think you can see my slides now. So what I really wanted to share with you today was just an overview of a briefing that we have recently launched on TCFD disclosure under the EU Non-Financial Reporting Directive. And with obviously the launch of the status report next week, we thought it would be a helpful opportunity to, as Mike said, refresh on the picture from Europe in terms of TCFD disclosure and consider how that is at present. Thank you. So just to recap overall on kind of how TCFD and the Non-Financial Reporting Directive in Europe link together. So the Non-Financial Reporting Directive calls for companies to disclose kind of 5 different aspects of information about their businesses for different topics, including what is referred to as environmental matters. It asks for this information to be reported in the annual report. Well, it did provide for member states to determine if a different location was suitable when they transposed it nationally. And a series of guidance was released alongside the directive, including some non-binding guidelines that covered all the topics in 2017, and then specifically climate-related guidelines in 2019. Next slide, please. And you'll see there, just highlighting specifically that those climate-related guidelines did actually integrate the TCFD recommendations themselves by mapping out for companies how they could provide climate-related disclosure for companies under the directive. Although crucially at the moment, this is non-binding guidance. Next slide, please. Thank you. So just looking to our research in this area, so we've conducted for the past couple of years, and we'll be continuing to do so, an annual review of company disclosures in Europe on climate and environment under the directive, really to just assess how well reporting is going, to provide feedback to the market and to policymakers on what's working and areas for improvement. So our latest review of 2019 reports was published in May of this year, and that assessed these aspects and really found a number of key areas of strength and key areas of weakness in disclosures, which you'll see on the screen there. And I think what was striking to us was that actually a lot of those areas of weakness regarding risk disclosure, regarding materiality, and obviously TCFD directly, were very closely linked to the types of information that companies were required to provide for the TCFD. So it was clearly that some of those aspects that companies were struggling with in their disclosures, whereas they were able to provide quite good reporting on some of the perhaps more familiar aspects of the EU directive relating to aspects such as KPIs and policies. Another overall challenge we saw was that the comparability of company reporting under the directive between companies and between years was to some extent quite limited, and that also the coherence of reporting between different aspects had challenges. So, for example, companies might publish an environmental disclosure for the Non-Financial Reporting Directive and then a separate report on TCFD as well, and often these disclosures might not be fully linked. So next slide, please, as well. Thank you. So turning specifically to TCFD, which is the subject of our latest briefing paper, which you'll be able to find on our website, we've highlighted in this paper the kind of key findings of our research regarding specifically the aspects relating to TCFD. And so the picture we saw was that for governance, we had around 3/4 of companies providing board and management information on climate change and environment within their annual report. Although crucially, we've noted that often climate change was not really explicit within that. So it may be implied or inferred that it was included within arrangements, but often the level of clarity that the TCFD calls for in these aspects couldn't be found. On strategy, we had just over half disclosing physical and transition risks, but clearly a significant minority who'd yet to sort of adopt this full risk lens in considering climate environmental risk. And then we saw very low levels of disclosure around the specific time horizons over the short, medium, and long term at which risks would impact the business, with only 6% providing this. And finally, on scenario analysis, we saw that 14% were using scenario analysis to disclose their resilience to climate change. So again, clearly quite limited in terms of adoption at the moment. On risk management, we had around 3/4 again who were integrating risks into their risk management on climate change. However, again, this was an area where disclosures were often not sufficiently explicit, although you might be able to infer things about the integration from what was reported. For example, you may see a climate risk within principal risk disclosures. Often the means by which climate change was integrated into this process was not fully clear. And then finally, on metrics and targets, perhaps this was a slightly stronger performing area in that all companies were starting to report metrics on climate, energy and water particularly. However, on carbon emissions, we saw that only just over half were including kind of scope 3 emissions relating to their value chain. Clearly, scope 3 might not be relevant to all companies, as that's kind of wider emissions from their value chain, including their supply chain and their customers. However, it's an important measure, I guess, of how broadly companies are starting to think about climate change or not. And finally, on metrics, what we also saw was that there was often limited clarity between what were the key metrics that companies were using to measure the implementation of their strategy on climate change, and what perhaps were just indicators that they were reporting for transparency. So users of the reports, and particularly investors, may not have been able to get the clarity here that they required. So the picture overall that our briefing shows, I guess, is that TCFD adoption within Europe is progressing. However, there are still some quite clear gaps. And obviously, as we'll hear from Eric's presentation on the status report, this echoes the global picture. However, I think it is interesting to consider Europe specifically, given that the directive in Europe did integrate TCFD, and there are many national governments as well who've showed support for the recommendations. And of course, the guidance itself for companies in Europe was released. So I think the fact that we're still seeing quite low levels of uptake in Europe on TCFD, even in light of this, shows that really, without mandatory adoption and without more action, we're just not quite seeing the progress that we need as yet on adoption of the recommendations. Next slide, please. So kind of building from these observations in our research, in our briefing, we've put forward a series of thoughts for companies as to how they can specifically look to improve TCFD disclosure within their reporting on the non-financial to businesses. So the TCFD recommends that companies assess materiality in a consistent manner as they're doing for other issues in their annual report. So we'd encourage this aspect to be considered. Secondly, and related to this, we recommend that climate-related information that's financially material should be included in the mainstream report. Again, this is consistent with the TCFD recommendations, which call for material financial information on climate change to be within mainstream reports, so not within a separate report that perhaps isn't clearly linked to what's in the annual report. And then finally, Seems quite simple, but really we say to align disclosures under the Non-Financial Reporting Directive with the TCFD core elements. So really, I guess what we're recommending here is using that guidance that shows how you can integrate these two disclosures and provide a connected picture, rather than perhaps providing one disclosure for the directive and another on TCFD. But really by linking the two, you can achieve that alignment and coherence that's needed in reporting. Next slide, please. And then for policymakers, we've also made a series of recommendations within our paper. As Mike mentioned, this is an ideal time to adopt such changes, given that the directive itself is currently being revised by the EU. So some of the aspects that we'd really recommend are considered in this process, and we've put forward in our various responses to the process the EU are currently running, is to remove the exemption that allows non-financial statements to be included outside of the mainstream report. So, again, this will support this point around consistency and comparability, aligned to the recommendations of the TCFD, which calls for that material integration into mainstream reports. And secondly, as we saw a particular weakness on principal risks, we've recommended that the Commission and the EU review this aspect of the directive to ensure that it's clear that businesses should include not just their impacts on the environment, which were perhaps more commonly reported in the reviews that we undertook, but also consider that the risks they will face from climate change, as the TCFD calls for. Thirdly, might seem obvious, but again, we think that climate change should be incorporated specifically into the wording of the directive. At the moment, it calls more generically for environmental disclosure, and although the guidance that sits alongside this clarifies this should include climate change, incorporating this wording into the directive will obviously remove any ambiguity here. And finally, in a similar manner, embedding the TCFD recommendations themselves into the directive's legislative text will ensure, again, that clarity is provided, that it is an expectation that companies provide this disclosure, rather than it sitting in a non-binding aspect of guidance as it does currently. So just moving on to the final slide, that kind of summarises the picture from our briefing on 2019. We're actually conducting or finalising our review of 2020 reports at the moment, and we'll be due to launch that in December, so please do keep an eye out. What we'll obviously cover in that report will be an update on reporting in the latest year of disclosures, particularly relating to TCFD again. And I think what will be interesting about this review is that it will be the first full year that companies will have had this guidance on climate-related reporting available to them. So we'll be able to consider how this has affected TCFD adoption in Europe. So that just provides a flavour of our picture, and I'll now hand back over so that Eric can obviously give us the latest very interesting insights from the TCFD directly as well.
Thank you very much, Fiona, for this overview of the state of play, and we're really looking forward to the next year's report, well, this year's review being launched, as Fiona mentioned, the 7th of December. So to see sort of what the trends are, where we're headed. What's your overall view, Fiona? Are we headed in the right direction? Are we going backwards? Where do we stand?
Sure. So I think it was interesting in these year's reports, as we said, we're quite close to finalising it. So I think some of the things that we've seen is more adoption of some of the aspects that companies were already doing well on TCFD in their reporting. So we're seeing quite a consistent picture regarding governance and regarding clarifying risk management processes. However, we are really still seeing those same challenges on the metrics aspects. The strategy aspects of disclosure, which I think will really echo what Eric will share with us. We really didn't see much change at all in the number of companies using scenario analysis, for example. So it's evident that really what's working and what companies are able to disclose is continuing to improve, but those areas of challenge very much remain.
Thank you, Fiona, and that's a very good handover to Eric to get a bit of a global perspective and a bird's eye view from the TCFD's perspective, of course, as well, where you see things headed, where you see the state of play being, and tell us all about the new status report and the new guidance that are being launched. Over to you, Eric, please.
Thank you, Michael, and thank you, Fiona. Good morning, everyone. I'm really delighted to be with you today. CDSB is a great, I'm speaking like Donald Trump now, correct? Is a great think tank. I've been very happy to be organizing a seminar at Deloitte premises in Paris in June 2019 with Marty McBrien from CDSB on when CDSB issued their comments on the TCFD and how to implement it. I think you guys have been really instrumental, and so has SASB, by the way, in really making it clearer to companies on how to implement those 11 disclosures grouped under 4 different recommendations that the TCFD came up with. You remember we came up with our recommendations at TCFD in June 2017. Since then, we've had 3 opportunities to provide a status report to let's say, global organizations. And the last one, the most recent one, was issued a few days ago, like last week. And it's very timely for me to present today some of those findings. I understand I have around 20 minutes to do that. There are that's correct, huh? Yeah, there are quite interesting findings in the document, and they are very much in line with what Fiona just presented. So there is indeed a significant momentum to support TCFD. Currently, there are over 1,500 companies and other organizations that have expressed support for the TCFD. And this includes over 1,340 companies with quite a high market capitalization, as you can see on the slide. And these supporters come from 78 countries that are colored in blue on the map. And the darker the color on this map, the more supporters each country has, as indicated in the legend. And in addition, you have over 110 regulators and governments, governmental entities from around the world that support the TCFD. That includes the governments of Belgium, Canada, Chile, Denmark, France, Japan, New Zealand, Sweden, and the United Kingdom. I was lucky enough to travel to quite a few of these countries, not New Zealand, but Australia this year. And it's really interesting. The previous year was a trip to Japan, which showed me how they are leading in terms of TCFD implementation globally in Japan. The central banks and supervisors from across the globe have also provided some positive feedbacks on TCFD. Or there is this NGFS, the network for greening the financial system, that has encouraged companies issuing public debt or equity to disclose in line with the TCFD recommendation. I was still on the previous slide, I'm sorry, but I was still on the first slide. Thank you so much. And we are seeing governments embed the recommendations. You have the European Commission that incorporated the TCFD recommendations into its guidelines. It's been said. The New Zealand has announced that it would introduce a mandatory climate-related financial disclosure regime. And so let's move to the next slide and focus on the 2020 status report. So similar to the previous status report, the one of 2020 provides an update on disclosure practices aligned with the TCFD. But it also provides an insights from a group of experts, expert users, as we call them, on specific climate-related information that they identified as the most useful. And there are 10 of them, you will see that. And secondly, and there are 4 different categories of outputs of our status report. There is guidance to address the top issues identified by the companies implementing the TCFD recommendations. There are case studies by 3 financial institutions, and there is a summary of all the major initiatives that support the TCFD. And so I think it's a very lively document. It's not only charts with the level of buy-in of the various recommendations. And if we can move to the next slide, please. I have 2 slides now that summarize the key takeaways and findings. And so the task force is really pleased to see the growth in the number of companies and other organizations that support the TCFD. There are nearly 700 organizations that became supporters of the TCFD since we issued our last report, which is 85% increase compared to our last status report. So really, there's very big momentum. In addition, nearly 60% of the world's 100 largest public companies support the TCFD and report in line with its recommendation or both. And so from its artificial intelligence review of company reports, the TCFD found that disclosure of climate-related financial information has increased on average by 6 percentage points between 2017 and 2019. However, companies' disclosure on the potential financial impact of climate change on their businesses, strategies, and financial planning is low, is very low, in fact. And this is the biggest hurdle, if you want. TCFD has an F in it, TCFD, financial disclosures. However, we don't see so much monetized financial disclosures being provided by the market. And when we look at disclosure levels for the 8 industries that we reviewed, we see the energy companies and the materials and building companies leading on TCFD-aligned disclosures. And so if we can maybe move to the next one, which is the continuation. Another key finding from our artificial intelligence review is that only 1 in 15 companies reviewed disclosed information on the resilience of their strategy. This is really low. It is increasing as compared to the previous 2 reports, but it remains very low. So the TCFD also found that the asset manager and asset owner reporting to their clients and beneficiaries is likely insufficient. And we believe that more progress may be needed to ensure clients and beneficiaries have the right information to make financial decisions. And based on a survey of expert users of climate-related information, the most useful information for financial decision-making is the impact of climate change on the company's business and strategy. So on the next several slides, I'll go maybe a little bit more into details. If we can move to the next slide. Yeah, so the overall picture. Consistent with the previous status reports, we use artificial intelligence, as I said. We reviewed 17,300 publicly available reports. Can you believe that? For about 1,700 companies in various industries and regions. And the companies in the artificial intelligence review population come from the 8 industries I just mentioned. So these are banking, insurance, energy, materials and buildings, transportation, agriculture, food and forest products, technology and media, and consumer goods. And this approach, this is a caveat that we also formulated in the previous status reports. We do not assess the quality of companies' climate-related financial disclosures, but we just intend to provide an indication of the alignment of the existing disclosures with the 11 disclosures. So overall, we found that disclosure of information is aligned with our recommendation, but continuing progress is needed. The percentage of companies disclosing TCFD-aligned information in 2019 is not greater than 41% for any one of the recommended disclosures. All right. And the percentage of companies disclosing the potential financial impact of climate change on their businesses, as I said, is 1 out of 16 companies, is 7% only. All right. So this is 10% points lower than the next lowest recommended disclosure. So there's a big issue there. All right. Obviously, we would like to better understand the challenges associated with disclosing information on the financial impact of climate change on a company. And this is part of our 2021 action plan. The TCFD is going to continue working And we are going to address that particular issue of making sure we understand collectively why it is so complicated to disclose financial information. If we can move, please, to the next slide. Thank you. On this slide, we have the 10 most useful disclosure elements that were identified by our group of users. They were identified as the most useful. The status report also encourages preparers to consider the users' ratings across nearly 60 disclosure elements that we proposed to this group. So as you can see, it's a little bit difficult for me to read in the format I have, but I don't think you will see big surprises on the right side of the slide, but certainly an interesting one in my view is the number 3, the the material climate-related issues identified for each sector and geography. The world, as you remember, the TCFD is really meant to make sure that there is a connection between the expectation of the world of asset managers and asset owners with the real life of companies. And the asset owners and asset managers, when they analyze the risks at stake with their portfolio, they have an approach which is sector-based or geography-based or both. And so it's not a surprise to me that this topic comes as number 3. And we see quite a few actually companies that do undertake climate-related scenario analysis on a selection of activities, a selection of geographies, and we see quite a few asset managers and asset owners also analyzing their portfolio using sectors by sector approach, one by one, and geography by geography approaches as well. That being said, let's move to the next slide, please. Thank you. Addressing implementation issues. We have quite interestingly here 4 different implementation issues that we have identified in the course of the past 2 years, in fact, or even 3 years. But it's the first time that we really provide numbers to their criticity, if you want. So 49% of our sample of 180 have identified a governance issue where climate is embedded in our processes, so it is challenging to discuss separately climate change in the governance disclosures. And as a practitioner, I see that big time. I see quite a lot of companies that are actually best in class, but they don't necessarily have a specific, let's say, board of directors meeting on the subject of climate change, for instance. They embed climate change within something bigger, which is likely going to be CSR or environmental issues at large. And to me, this is okay in a way, but it's the recommendation of the TCFD is to have a specific focus on climate change. The second one on strategy is about disclosing scenario analysis assumptions. This is difficult because this includes a lot of confidential business information. And as a practitioner in risk management during 15 years, one of the outputs of a risk management job for clients was the risk map. And when my clients had a risk map at hand that we had helped develop, obviously they would not necessarily disclose the results because this is proprietary information for some of the risks. It's a little bit the same for climate-related scenario analysis. And at TCFD, we take stock of that. We understand that. indeed there are difficulties providing to the market the detailed information on the scenario analysis assumptions. So in terms of risk management, climate is integrated into their risk management processes, and therefore there is no need to have separate disclosures. 36% said so. So yes, indeed. Again, as an ERM practitioner, enterprise risk management practitioner, it's always a good recommendation to encompass all risks together. So why would we have a specific climate-related risk management, risk assessment and risk management process? So there are difficulties there. And the last one is in terms of metrics and targets, there's a lack of standardized metrics for the industries of the responders. This is indeed a key topic, lack of standardization. Next slide, please. So I just want to say a few words on the other documents. If we move to the next slide, the guidance, there is the guidance for non-financial companies on conducting the climate-related scenario analysis. And this is a really good document. I want to spend one slide on that. There is a guidance on integrated climate-related risks into existing risk management processes. And finally, a consultation document on forward-looking metrics in the financial sector, and that includes the very controversial temperature of portfolios. So let us move to my first slide on scenario analysis for non-financial companies. So the guidance is really, in addition to what we at TCFD already published in June 2017. If you remember, we had a 35-page document already. But this is something around 130 pages, including quite a few appendices. Deloitte actually wrote 2 of the appendices, one on existing reference scenarios of the market, such as the ones of the IEA and the ones of the IPCC. And we also published an appendix on the data providers available to conduct the scenario analysis. So the guidance provides practical, process-oriented ways to use climate-related scenario analysis, ideas for disclosing the resilience of the strategy to different climate-related scenarios. And it's very practical. I really recommend reading it. It's really, in my view, even more important than reading the status report. So for what reason? Because as we suggested this morning, the scenario analysis is the one recommendation that is by far the most difficult to implement. So the guidance focuses on the elements of establishing organizational structures and processes to conduct the scenario analysis. And it really develops in detail the development process, including the scenario types, the structural elements, and the sources of the scenarios. That being said, I think I'm close to finalizing. Just to let you know what will be, because I believe that you will receive the slides, but we had the next slide, please. A slide on the second, let's say the third report that was published last week is guidance aimed at companies that are interested in integrating climate-related risks into their existing risk management processes and disclosing information on their risk management processes in alignment with the task force recommendation. And on the next slide, the forward-looking financial sector's metrics. We, frankly speaking, discussed this heavily. It started in the fall 2019. We had the chance of having Mark Carney join us that time in London for a plenary session of the TCFD. And Mark, no, I'm wrong. Mark came in February this year. But we started the discussion last fall because Mark Carney was willing that we really reflect upon this temperature of portfolio thing. And we discussed it in front of Mark, as I said, in February this year. And we concluded that in our view, TCFD, I mean, it's a little bit early to propose that the asset managers and asset owners implement the so-called temperature of the portfolio KPI. So, because there were, we showed how different methodologies could lead to different temperatures and different results, and for that reason, it would not reflect positively on the TCFD to recommend something with no underlying robust and commonly shared methodology. That's why we propose to the market a 90-day public consultation period until January the 27th of next year to answer questions that we're asking to sound the maturity of the market to implement such a type of disclosure. And on the next slide, please, the next steps, and this will be my last slide. We are going to work again. You might have heard that TCFD was supposed to be continuing until end of 2017, and then end of 2018, end of 2019, end of 2020. We still have work for 2021, I'm glad to say. So what we are going to do is a fourth status report. And so we'll analyze the extent to which the largest companies describe the financial impact of climate-related risks and opportunities. I alluded to that already. We are going to dig a little bit further into the challenges associated with making such monetized disclosure. And we are also going to do a plan. We are also going to consider ways to gain more direct information on the reporting practices by the asset managers and the asset owners to their clients and beneficiaries. And finally, we are going to consider the results, obviously, of that particular survey that I just presented in my previous slide. And obviously, we are going to summarize the findings and provide some recommendations regarding those forward-looking financial sector metrics. With that, I think that would be, I guess, the end of my presentation.
Thank you very, very much, Eric. It's really helpful to have you present all these reports. We're all working through them, so it's good to have a head start and understand what they're all about. And I'm also very, very happy to hear about the guidance that you've produced on scenario analysis. In particular, we have by far this is the most frequently asked section of the TCFD recommendations that we hear from companies. So I am sure that many will devour it and use it as their Bible on their desk to move forward. Now we only have a few minutes left, so if you do have questions, please put them in the chat. But before then, I wanted to ask Fiona about actually something that Eric said. It's also something that I hear from companies quite a lot. You want to implement the TCFD recommendations. You want to show that you've implemented the TCFD recommendations. So you want to be very explicit about including climate-related matters. But sometimes, as Eric said, it's part of your wider CSR, ESG, sustainability strategy. So have you seen any examples of good approaches where companies have been able to do something smart around this? Perhaps there isn't an answer yet, but this is a question that I certainly hear almost on a daily basis.
Sure. I think I was reflecting on that very same point throughout Eric's presentation as well, because I think, as you say, that balance between how you achieve specificity yet conciseness, I think, came through really strongly, and I think it very much echoes what we've observed too. I think, from my perspective, from reviewing company reports, I think it is a hard balance to strike. But I think at the moment, if you're not specific, the assumption will be that it's not there, right? Unless you can really see it. I think we're not at the point where you can not be explicit, because it wouldn't otherwise be assumed. And I think, as Eric shared in his presentation, there are specific reasons why you would want to know about climate change, obviously given its time horizons, given the nature of the uncertainties, etc. It does warrant a specific discussion. I think the companies that have achieved that well are really just having a laser focus on materiality. So I think it's that balance between being specific, but specific about what's material for you. So we see some companies, I think, who are well-meaning in attempts to be quite specific about a lot of things, and then you get a very, very long climate risk report, which is a good starting point, I think, because you've put that information on the table. I think the next step really there is applying that financial materiality lens to really summarize the specific aspects within your mainstream report that are relevant. And I think, as we touched upon already as well, wherever you can, just drawing linkages and references between parts of the report as well. So, if you have a small section on climate change, but then you just put those clear links in that show how that links to risk management, go to the governance section for information on committees, etc. It can do quite a lot, I think, just having those little references there. It saves you from, restating what you've already said, but it just shows clearly that there's that integration and coherence. So I think that, for me, is where I've seen it work best so far.
Great, thank you very much. And I see Eric nodding, which is a good sign.
Michael, we could do a little bit of advertising, Michael, on the report that we contributed to from the EFRAG lab, EFRAG being the European Financial Reporting Advisory Group. And Michael, you were leading the group in which I was contributing. This report was out in February, and it's basically a compilation of good practices. And so I would recommend that you go to this report. There are quite a few case studies on what we at EFRAG Lab believed were good TCFD reports. Or TCFD.
Very good point, actually.
Disclosures, yeah.
Thank you for that reminder. It's always good to see what your competitors, your other organizations in your sectors and in your field are doing. It's the best way to learn and evolve, and perhaps you can improve on their approaches. So highly recommended reading for sure. Now,
There's
Eric, one more
interesting question by Matthew Carr. Thank you, Matthew. Any evidence that TCFD has cut emissions yet? Well, no, there is not. Nobody, no think tank, no NGO, as far as I know, has computed something like that. It would be difficult, but it would be doable, I think. Namely, it would be maybe doable to use the 2,000 companies that the TCFD used as a sample last, let's say, in 2017, and compile their CO2 emissions, scope 1 and 2, and compare that to the ones of 2020. But let us say something. TCFD is not only about CO2. TCFD is about the holistic approach to risks and opportunities related to climate change. And frankly, it's also outside in, which means it's also how can climate change impact you as a company in the future, in the very far future, such as 10 years from now, 15 years from now. Obviously, I won't say that TCFD does not also contribute to resolving our CO2 emissions problem, because otherwise TCFD would not have put CO2 emissions as its number 10 disclosure. But however, it's not the main focus, all right? So both are connected, outside in and inside out, all right? The more you emit, the more the regulators will punish you in a way, with a high carbon price, etc. So these are connected. But the number one objective of TCFD is not a disclosure on CO2. All right.
Very good point, and it's another question we often get, especially in Europe, as in connection with Europe's policy objectives, the Green Deal, emissions reduction targets, and this, of course, double materiality under the Non-Financial Reporting Directive. I think I couldn't agree more. Understanding the limitations and really the focus of the TCFD, what it does and what it doesn't do, is perhaps a key area to make sure that we get high quality and decision useful disclosures as well. We have only, I believe, 1 more minute left to our scheduled time. So with that, I will slowly close, bring this discussion to a close. Just to close up with a couple of final points. As Eric said, the slides will be circulated. So if you want to look into them again, they will be in your inbox. Thank you very much for joining us. And the last point I wanted to say is, as you are on this journey of TCFD implementation, of non-financial reporting implementation, we are here to support you as well. You see our email address there. We are working with companies to understand how we can support them. And of course, I'm sure you can also contact Eric and his team for further support as well. So thank you very much to Eric. Thank you very much to Fiona for an excellent discussion this morning. Eric, you didn't even shy away from the difficult questions around emissions. Thank you for your honesty and good spirits today. And thank you all for listening. And we hope to see you on another webinar soon.